Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on network monitoring. Now in this lesson, we're going to look at a few different ways of monitoring your network. But before we do, I'd like to first talk to you about some of the why behind, why is it that we would want to monitor our network? And as much as you might be thinking to yourself right now, well, isn't it kind of obvious why you'd want to monitor something? And if it's not obvious right now, it should become obvious as I go through a couple of these reasons here. I will tell you that there's a lot of network administrators out there who end up making a decision that it's not as important relative to maybe the workload that's involved, or just don't feel like doing it at all, and maybe don't think that these reasons are important at all. And, well, I'll tell you that they really are. It's really important that you do monitor your network. So what are some of these reasons? The first reason I'd like to mention would be performance. Now, performance of your network is something that we're going to talk about in another lesson. Okay, I have a whole other lesson on the actual performance itself. But from the concept of why you monitor, well, it's to maintain that performance. And what happens in a lot of networks, especially when you have administrators who don't consistently monitor, you set up your network and you've got this great performance, right? You're at a level right here. Everything's working perfectly. But because you're not monitoring, what happens is that performance kind of goes down, and it goes down, and it goes down. And you don't know about it until it gets like down to here, right? And that's when people are calling you up going, what's going on? Everything's slow. I can't do my job. You don't want to wait till it gets to here, because getting it from here back up to here again is really difficult. And the reason why is because little things may have been happening along the way as it worked its way down. And that's why it's important to, well, keep watching it, keep monitoring it. And that kind of bleeds into the second reason that I have for you, which has to do with maintenance. Okay, just overall maintenance and upkeep of the network. Well, you need to know what's going on in order to know what needs maintaining. And I say that it kind of relates with performance, because if you're maintaining the network, well, then this automatic progression that tends to happen may not happen, because you're keeping things up to date, you're keeping things maintained, and you may lose performance over time anyway, but it'll be much more gradual. Now, the last reason is another really important reason, and to many people might be the most important reason for monitoring your network, and that is security. Okay, you need to be able to see what's going on in your network to know that it's not being attacked. You got to make sure that it is secure. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the specifics when it comes to security a little bit later on in the lesson, where we'll go right into the detail of using monitoring to kind of look for those security holes. Okay, not just look to see, are we under attack, but find the holes. So that's kind of the why, the main why. I mean, there's probably another 50 smaller reasons that you may want to monitor a network, but when it comes to the big picture, you want to make sure that you maintain performance, and you'll notice I use the word maintain performance because maintenance is part of it, and then also make sure that your network stays secure. So the first type of network monitoring that I want to talk to you about is something called a packet sniffer. A packet sniffer, first of all, rather than try to physically show you something, it can be either hardware or software. Or quite frankly, it's really software, because even if it's hardware, it's just hardware that has software built into it. What is the idea behind a packet sniffer? A sniffer is used to capture and listen to transmissions which are traveling on the network. Now, a lot of people will think of packet sniffers as being the kind of thing that bad people use. Right? That's the kind of thing that a hacker would use to try to maybe eavesdrop on your network and get information. Now, as much as that may be true, that packet sniffers are used by bad people to do bad things, you need to know as a network administrator that packet sniffers can also be very useful in a good way. You can use these packet sniffers to help you find vulnerabilities in the network and notify you if there's a possible intrusion. Meaning, if you know that the bad people are going to be using it to hack into your network, Well, then maybe you should also be using a packet sniffer to find out where these vulnerabilities are that they're coming in through, and to recognize if maybe it's already happened. Someone's already on your network. You can use these packet sniffers to help realize, hey, that's some extra traffic there that I don't think belongs. Okay, so that's the idea of using a packet sniffer. The next type of monitor I want to talk to you about is called a port scanner. And again, similar to the packet sniffer, port scanners are very typically used by bad people to do bad things. Because, well, what are they used for? They're used to look for open ports on a network or a system. Right? So you go ahead and scan and go, oh, look, this firewall's got that port open. I can get in on the network. Or it could even be an individual system if it has, let's say Windows firewall on it. What ports are open on that system? So if the bad people are going to be using this, well, then you, as an administrator, can also look for these same vulnerabilities and then mitigate against them. I will also make a quick mention here that typically port scanning is done through software. I mean, again, there are hardware and software port scanners, but really the hardware port scanners is just a piece of hardware that has software installed on it. So now let's move into a form of monitoring that is truly for the administrators. Right? We saw the sniffers and the port scanners, which are used by the bad guys, and quite frankly are used by the good guys or the administrators, well, to help recognize when it's being done by the bad guys. But now we're going to talk about stuff that only the good guys use, and that would be intrusion detection software, or IDS, and intrusion prevention software, or IPS. Now, I will tell you that an IDS and an IPS is very similar. Okay, there's only one main difference between them. The IDS, the intrusion detection software, is used to watch for network patterns which could represent an attack on a system or on your network. Okay, and the reason I keep saying system or network is because with all of these particular monitoring tools, you could monitor an individual computer, or you may want to monitor your network at the perimeter. In this case, we're watching for certain patterns of activity, certain known patterns which represent what typically may be an intrusion. So a log is then maintained of all this activity, and or an administrator may be notified if certain activity, certain intrusion-based activity seems to be taking place. So what is intrusion prevention software then? Well, an IPS is pretty much the exact same thing as an IDS, except for instead of just keeping a log and or notifying an administrator, an IPS is designed to automatically attempt to stop an attack. In other words, if certain activity is taking place that makes it look like there's an attack, instead of just like ringing a bell and saying, hey, administrator, come look at this. No, you can actually have built-in automation when it comes to stopping that attack. Okay, so you could automatically shut down certain ports on a firewall, or you could automatically move some data. You could automatically completely cut off internet access. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can do. The only thing that I caution you when using an IPS is that very often with these intrusion detection systems, you're going to get false positives. So you need to make sure you are really familiar with your environment and know that it's very possible that if you're going to have automation built in, that a false positive is going to make it kick in and shut certain things down. That's another one, by the way. It could shut down systems. But when it shuts things down, whether it be the firewall or internet or a system or whatever it may be, users are very possibly going to be interfered with. So you want to make sure that you're very certain that it's only doing that if there's truly an attack underway. Now, the next type of monitoring that I want to talk to you about is the idea of using logs. Just about everything in a computer system is logged, right? I mean, there's logs all over the place. When you install software, there's a log. The individual software itself very often will have a log. Operating systems have a log. If something is done on a computer, odds are there was at least a capability, if not an actual log, that was created for that action. So you need to be familiar with some of these logs and be prepared to go review these logs on a somewhat regular basis, as well as when something happens. Now, there are 3 types of logs that I've listed for you here. The first one is called system logs, which are just that. They're logs about everything that goes on with the system. Okay, all system-related events, things that have to do with the operating system itself. Whereas we have other types of event logs, which look at specific events taking place on a system. And you have history logs, which is the idea of keeping a history of those events. If you get the idea here, although I've listed these separately as system logs, event logs, and history logs, they're kind of the same thing. It's all about logging. The system log just means it's specific to system-related events, whereas you might have like an application log that is specific to application events. You have auditing logs, which have to do specifically with security or audit-based events. But they're all about events, so they're all event logs to some extent. And then the idea behind history is, well, that you're actually keeping a history of these logs, not just looking at them real time. I will tell you, from a security perspective, I said that you want to look at these logs on a regular basis, but I will recommend that regular be regular but irregular. And the reason I say that is because if you are known to review the logs every Wednesday at noon, you religiously, every Wednesday at noon, go through the logs, and you're known for that, well, if I'm somebody who wants to try to get away with something on your network, I know that I'm going to do it Wednesday at 1 o'clock because I know that you're not going to catch me doing it for 7 days. Because you're not going to go back to those logs till the following Wednesday at noon. So I've got almost the entire week, the entire 7 days to get away with what I want to get away with without you ever looking at it. So that's why I say you want to check it regularly, or I'll tell you what, instead of using the word regularly, I'll say frequently. We're going to say you want to do it frequently, but irregularly. Now, there's another type of monitoring. It tends to be vendor-specific. Okay, so there are many different versions of this protocol that I want to talk to you about here called the Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP. It is vendor-specific. Very often, if you are using a certain vendor's types of servers, you will also use SNMP specific from that vendor. It will be set up in a way that is designed to work well with their equipment. What is the idea behind SNMP? It is used to collect information about the network. It does so by using management systems, which, like I said, are very often vendor-specific, or we could say proprietary to a specific vendor, and agents. And the agents are not always proprietary, are not always vendor-specific. The management systems are what actually gather the data and analyze the data. The agents are what collect the data. And there are 2 ways that the data can get from the agent to the management system. The first would be that the management system can query an agent. Okay, so the management can go out to an agent. And by the way, these agents, they could be computers, they could be other networking devices like routers and switches. Okay, they all have these abilities to have these agents built into them. So the management system might go out there and query it and say, hey, give me all your info that you've gathered over the last X period of time on the network so I can analyze it. Okay, so that's one way, and you might schedule that, right? You might schedule it so the management system comes and gets the data, once a day or once a week or whatever it might be, maybe once an hour. The other way that the information can get from the agents to the management systems is with what's called triggers, or more specifically with SNMP, they tend to be called traps. The idea is that the agent is watching all kinds of network activity, and then there are certain thresholds that have been set so that the agent sees a certain type of network activity, almost similar to how the intrusion detection system worked, right? You're watching for certain activity. If you cross a certain threshold, the agent can reach out to the management system and say, hey, you know what? I got some info here. You may want to see this. The analogy I like to use when it comes to SNMP is I like to think of it as the management system is kind of like the police. Right? If you think of the police department, they're the management systems. They gather data and solve crimes with it. So we can get specific to, we'll say the detectives at the police department, right? And the agents, we'll say, are all the rest of us, just average people. If the management system, or we could say the police or the detectives, think that there's something going on and there's a crime they want to solve, well, then they might come out to you and say, hey, can I ask you some questions about what you saw and what you heard? Right? And your brain has gathered that information. You then share it with them. But there may be certain thresholds where you, as an agent, will reach out to the police. You see somebody pull out a gun and shoot somebody else dead, you're going to call the police and say, I got some info here that I just gathered, and you may want to come take a look at this. Okay, so that's how I like to think of it. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about SNMP is that it has 3 versions. Version 1, 2, and 3. And it's pretty simple. Version 3 is the current version. Versions 1 and 2 are pretty much out of date. As a matter of fact, for the most part, we kind of almost went from version 1 straight to version 3. Each version did make security and communication improvements. And what I will tell you is that version 1, it was slow and it wasn't very secure and it had some issues. They came out with version 2, which had some new ideas, but it never really took real strong hold of the marketplace. And by the time those new ideas did take hold, version 3 had come out, which had even more and newer improved ideas. Okay, so I don't want you to get too caught up in that because, again, a lot of this stuff tends to be more proprietary. If you're going to work with SNMP, you would need training on that specific version of SNMP. I can tell you even in some Microsoft classes, we used to start to go into SNMP, and it's like we can only take the lessons so far because depending on what management system you're actually using, it changes everything. Even though the Microsoft agents can communicate with all these other vendors. All right, so I don't want you to worry about SNMP too much other than the concept of it. Now, speaking of SNMP and the logic behind it, there is another type of utility primarily used by Unix, and it was another logging type solution called syslog. And it is similar to SNMP in the sense that you have this separation from the software which is generating the messages from the software that's managing those messages. And it was also the same idea where you could now allow devices that don't necessarily have a full-blown operating system, like a router or something like that, to be able to go ahead and to gather that information and to be monitored. And so that brings us to the end of this lesson on network monitoring, where we first of all talked about the reasons, and I really want to come back to that and emphasize it's really important that you monitor the network. And yes, it can be time-consuming, but it's worth it. And after that, we looked at a few different approaches to network monitoring, whether it be some literal tools or even just the idea of looking through logs or overall things like SNMP management. So that's it. You now know how to monitor your network. I'll see you in the next lesson.